whatever the crowd sounds like, whatever the scene looks like from the place I'm standing, I'm going to tune my ears to the low infrasound frequency of heaven, and I'm going to listen to the voice of the promiser to lead me and go with me and stay with me wherever I am. And from there, I will never miss home. How's your homing device doing these days? Are there signs you're flying off course? Do you have the wrong enemies? Are you living life generously? Are your eyes set on Him rather than just the mirages of His blessings? If you got a Bible, you can open up or power up. Meet me in Genesis chapter 13. Genesis chapter 13 today as we continue this teaching series looking through the story of a guy named Abraham. Looking at how to find and how to live in the blessing of God when everything around you and sometimes everything within you feels broken. We call the series Altered, and we've called it that for a couple of different reasons. One is just in looking at the story. When you read through Abraham's story in the scripture, it's hard to miss the altars in the story. It feels like in almost every scene, Abraham's either moving towards an altar or moving away from an altar or building an altar or worshiping at an altar. They're everywhere in his story. We've said it's not just about the places in the story, it's the picture that the places paint of Abraham's story itself. And in fact, remember what an altar is. We've said an altar is a permanent structure. It's made of hard, broken things put together in a way that point towards the faithfulness of God. And that's Abraham's story. It's not just a place. Sometimes in his faithfulness and often in his brokenness. Abraham's story is a story of hard, broken pieces that come together to point towards a God who's always, always, always faithful. Last week we saw God's faithfulness in the middle of brokenness that happened within Abraham. He flunks the famine test. But today we're going to watch Abraham as a faithful man navigating brokenness all around him. Before we talk about Abraham and a guy named Lot, I need to tell you a story about Bob. So Bob found his 15 minutes of fame over a 4,000-mile mistake. So Bob is a competitive carrier pigeon. Did you know that was a thing? I didn't know that was a thing until a couple of years ago. I saw a news article about an animal shelter in Alabama that was trying to arrange first-class travel for a man and his prized homing pigeon named Bob to get back to Australia. So you should know about me. I'm not really usually a sucker for clickbait, but first-class ticket from Alabama to Australia for a man and his prized homing pigeon, 100% of the time I'm clicking on that. And it turns out it's a true story about Bob and his owner, a guy named Alan Todd. Alan is from Gateshead, Australia, and he breeds competitive homing pigeons. And then he participates in these races where you take your pigeon to an undisclosed location. You don't tell the pigeon where he is. And then you let him go with a whole bunch of his friends and you tell him, I guess, to go home. And then he does. And it's a race to see who gets home first. It's a whole thing. And apparently Alan Todd and his carrier pigeon Bob are some of the very best in the world at this thing. So Alan, as the story goes, took Bob from Gateshead, Australia to a place called Guernsey, Australia. It's about 400 miles away. So if you need a little bit of scale, it's about as far as from here to Baton Rouge or from here to Branson. And Alan takes Bob there and then sets him free with a whole bunch of his friends and I guess tells him to go home. And then Alan flies back to Gateshead, Australia to wait for Bob to show up. So normally it's a trip that should take Bob about 10 hours. So after 12 hours, Alan is getting just a little bit nervous. Then 14 hours, and then 24 hours, and then 48 hours, and Alan began to assume the worst about his prized carrier pigeon, Bob. 2 weeks later, Alan gets a phone call from an animal shelter in Alabama telling him that they'd found Bob. They'd seen the tag on his foot, and they called Gateshead, Australia to tell him that his homing pigeon had landed 4,000 miles off course. So what happened to Bob? Well, your guess is as good as mine. You know, maybe he got caught in a jet stream and the wind blew him off course. It's possible. It's possible that he followed a flock of other migrating birds that were headed in the wrong direction towards Alabama. Maybe. It's possible Bob was just bored with his life with Alan there in Gateshead, Australia, and decided to hitch a ride on a cargo ship bound across the Atlantic for Alabama. We don't know. But it turns out this kind of thing happens to carrier pigeons from time to time. Nobody knows why, because, and this is the fascinating thing, nobody really knows how homing pigeons find home at all. The scientists are all divided. The pigeons aren't talking. The current theory is that the pigeon's ears are tuned to incredibly low infrasound frequency that are caused by waves deep in the ocean that resonate across the surface of the earth and give every location on earth a unique frequency signature that the homing pigeons can hear and fly towards. And that certain things in the middle of flight can interfere with the sound that cause the pigeons to lose track of where they are, where they're going. So they can't find home. So I don't know about carrier pigeons, though I've done a little more research on them. Okay, a lot more research on them in the last couple of weeks than I'm comfortable admitting to you, even in a Grace Place. So I don't know a lot about carrier pigeons. I do know about you, and I know about me. And I know about literally every single human that you will ever meet on the face of the earth. Every single one of us is born with an internal longing to find home with a capital H. All of us. Something deep inside of us that tells us our life isn't enough, but perhaps it could be. That we're missing something we just can't seem to find, but that's out there, waiting for us. Call it a unscratchable itch. Call it a God-shaped hole. Call it paradise lost. Call it whatever you want. But it's an instinct inside every single one of us, regardless of our age, or our stage, or socioeconomic status, or culture, that resonates with the frequency of home with a capital H. And our whole life feels like a journey to find it, or perhaps to find it again. And that's where Bob's story intersects with our story. How do we know, as hard as we're flying, maybe even as great as we've been, that we're not going to get to the end of our journey and find ourselves a long way from the home that we're searching for? The story of Abraham gives us an answer, and maybe more importantly, a solution. By showing us Abraham's story up against the story of someone else. Both of them set their sights on home, but one of them ends up a long, long, long way away. I want to show you. Look at Genesis chapter 13, beginning in verse 5. Genesis chapter 13, beginning in verse 5. The writer says this, "Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions," pay attention to this, "were so great, and they were not able to stay together. and quarreling arose. So know this, quarreling is not just a little conflict. Quarreling means they were trying to destroy each other. Quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. So Abram said to Lot, let's not have any quarreling between you and me or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. So if you remember the story from last week, Abram flunked the test of famine. He's run out of Egypt with a fortune that wasn't nearly as good as he felt like it would be, or we feel like it should be. He's traveling with his family, including his nephew Lot. And I might as well tell you, if you don't know the rest of the story, this is not going to turn out well for Lot. Lot is Bob in the story. He is on the fast track to Alabama. Well, Sodom, but you get the point. I think they're both in the SEC. This is the first clue that there's something wrong with Lot's homing device. Perhaps that yours and mine needs recalibration as well. Go ahead and write this down if you're taking notes, then I'll show it to you in the passage. The first indication that there's a problem with our internal homing mechanism is we pick the wrong enemies. We pick the wrong enemies. So I'm coaching a 10-year-old girls soccer team right now. Yeah. I feel like this is a conversation that I'm having with a couple of them after every single practice and every single game we play. It's like after every practice, she won't pass me the ball, or she's yelling at me that I'm not playing my position, or, she said that they scored because we're too slow. Forget running an offsides trap. Forget, set plays on corner kicks. I'm just trying to teach these ladies how to pick the right enemy. Like, look over there at the neon unicorns. They're the enemy. Well, let's try to get some tears out of them for a change, You guys are on the same team. Get together and act like grown-ups. I mean, maybe not like grown-ups. It's not really a 10-year-old soccer team problem. It's true of the 80-year-old father of the Christian, Jewish, Muslim faith and his grown man nephew. And maybe of somebody you know too. And maybe of someone you see in the mirror from time to time. You see how the story draws it out? These guys have all of this stuff. And the people that work for them start trying to destroy each other. And verse 7 adds that weird sentence in the middle of the story. It says the Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in the land at the time. You know what the narrator's saying? There were real enemies there. There were real fights to fight. There were real battles to engage. This wasn't the one. And again, this is not just a 10-year-old soccer problem or an Abraham problem. It's a people problem. Paul makes the same point in the New Testament, doesn't he? The book of Ephesians. Our struggle's not against flesh and blood. Not ultimately, and especially when it comes to family, biological family, spiritual family, right? Democrats are not your enemy, church. Conservatives, not your enemy, church. The school board is not your enemy. The HOA is not your enemy. Your parents, teenagers, not your enemy. Your roommates, not your enemy, right? It goes on and on and on. Now, does that mean we don't have conflict with family? We don't have conflict with the Democrats, with Republicans, with the HOA, with a roommate, with your family, with your parents? It doesn't mean that. Notice, Abraham's here for the conflict. In fact, he leans into the conflict. He participates in the conflict. He is not willing to quarrel. He's not out to destroy family. He leans into the conflict. Abram moves toward Lot in the story, and he says, hey, we're family. Like, we can do conflict. We don't need to destroy each other. Let's come up with a solution that preserves the relationship, even if it means we can't all have what we want. In fact, and this is important, Abram says, I'll sacrifice first, and I'll sacrifice most. And we're going to come back in just a moment to the reason behind Abram's response, because it's just as powerful as the response. But I wonder what that posture would look like from you, for me, to engage intra-squad conflicts and really important disagreements as teammates, as family, instead of enemies. Even if it means that we don't agree. Even if it means we can't compromise. There's almost always a way to preserve the relationship without destroying each other. Here, Abram does it by leaning into it and offering a solution that doesn't cause him or Lot to give away the farm or the family. And Abram offers, notice this, to take the position of humble sacrifice, even though he's the one with all the power. And he's got the legal standing, he's got the age standing, he's got the spiritual standing. God made the promise to him of the land, right? Like he's richer, he's older. God was the one that gave him the land already. It's his. He's on the right side of the argument. He's on the God side of the argument. He had every right to be calling the shots. For all those reasons, he had every right to bury Lot out there in the desert in Egypt. And for all those reasons, he chooses not to. Look at verse 9. Abram says, we're close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Lot responded. He looks around. He sees that the whole plain of the Jordan towards Zoar was well watered. Notice this, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. So you spot it pretty quickly, don't you? Right there, like Abraham is living one way, even towards a guy whose people are out to destroy him. Lot's living a totally different way, even towards someone who loves him. And I already told you, Lot's the one who ends up in Alabama. Notice this is an indicator that your homing device is broken. We pick the wrong enemies, and second, we fail to live generously. We fail to live generously. So you notice, you see it right there, Abram's posture is, look at all we have. Lot's posture is, look at all I could get. Totally different perspectives. From the exact same vantage point, right? Stephen Covey talked about living with a scarcity mindset versus living with an abundance mindset. This is about as clear-cut an example as you can get of that, isn't it? And let me flag this just for the 2 or 3 of you who have already started hitting the brakes because you heard me say the word generosity, and maybe because of a stereotype you've got of pastors or bad experience you had in the church in the past, you're pretty sure that I'm going to use the word generosity as an on-ramp to try to guilt you into giving money to our church, okay? Relax. I'm not going to do that. In fact, in part because of this principle, we don't operate out of a scarcity mindset at Doxology. We don't believe that we've got to guilt you or grab from you in order to get you to give. We'd rather be having people that give out of their own generosity and not their religiously motivated guilt here. Okay, but notice, this passage, it isn't really about money anyway. At least not to anyone but Lot, who already has lots of money. But he wants more. And notice that's always the case when it comes to generosity or lack thereof. Generosity is almost never really about money. It's almost always about our greed and our God. The thing that's holding Lot back isn't lack. He doesn't lack. The thing that's holding Lot back is fear. He doesn't trust. His tight-fisted posture says, I'm going to grab everything I can to make sure I always have everything I need. So I never have to trust anyone to provide, not even God. And you see the problem with living that way? I mean, yeah, a generous life is a risk. It's a risk with your money. It's a risk with your time. It's a risk with your influence, a risk with your position and your reputation. If you close your fist, you control your risk. But you also can't ever hold more than the size of your fist. And you're not in the posture to receive at all. Abraham, on the other hand, he's generous towards God. He's generous towards Lot. And guess who's generous to Abraham in response? Look at verse 14. The Lord said to Abraham, after Lot parted from him, look around from where you are to the north and the south and the east and the west. That's pretty much everywhere, right? All the land that you see, I will give you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted too. Go, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. So Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tents. There he built an altar to the Lord. The broken pieces, the hard circumstance are pointing to the faithfulness of God at the end of the story, right? But notice the other thing. Abraham hasn't moved in verse 14. He's still standing in the same place as far as we can tell. That he and Lot looked at the whole land where Abram opened up his hand and Lot took everything he could. And what does God say? God says, look as far as you can see from here. Not just the whole plain of the Jordan, everything north and south and east and west, all of it, I'm giving it to you. Notice, Abram is going to receive back everything he gave. Now, don't miss the point of that promise. Okay, this isn't prosperity gospel where if you give money, somehow God's obligated to give you more money. Okay, that kind of thing, that isn't motivated by a heart of generosity or devotion. It's motivated by a heart of greed and idolatry that tries to leverage God as a part of your Ponzi scheme to get rich. Okay, that's not what this is. But this is the working out of a principle that you see show up all throughout Scripture. And that's that when you live a life that reflects the goodness and the generosity of God from the vantage point of eternity, you will never, ever, ever come up on the losing end. And that's key for Abram, isn't it? He's got his eyes set on home with a capital H. And he's got his heart tuned in to the person and the promise of God. Lot thinks he does. He thinks he's flying towards paradise, but it's not paradise. It's just a mirage. In fact, I can show you. Look back at verse 10. It says, Lot looked around and saw the whole plain of the Jordan toward Zoar was well watered, notice this, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out towards the east. Remember a couple of weeks ago, east is an Easter egg in the Bible. Going all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, when humanity was exiled from the garden, from home with a capital H. Which direction did they go when they were exiled? Toward Dallas. Almost without exception, when you see in the Bible people going east, it's a clue that they are walking away from paradise. Even when in Lot's case, notice this, you think home with a capital H is where you're headed. Did you notice that? He saw that the plain of Jordan looked like the garden of God. But it's not the garden of God. The whole thing is a mirage. We know our homing device is broken when we chase mirages of eternity. Okay, you know what a mirage is, right? So remember Sesame Street? I don't know why I remember this little skit from Sesame Street, but this is one of the ones that's just burned in my mind, maybe because it's where I learned my first Spanish word. You see this guy, and he's crawling through the desert, and as he's crawling through the desert, he's thirsty, and he just over and over keeps saying one word, and over, it's agua, agua. And he's crawling, and then in the distance, remember this, he sees palm trees, and he thinks that it's an oasis, and so he keeps crawling toward it, crying out, agua, agua. And as he gets there, what does he find out? Not an oasis. It's a mirage. And he crawls away from the place where he thought he saw palm trees, still crying out, agua, agua. It only looked like what he was looking for. So notice that about Lot. Lot looks at the whole plain of the Jordan, and he thinks, that looks like Eden. Why? Because of the environment and the experience he anticipates there for himself. But the writer of Genesis wants you to notice something. It's a one-dimensional vision of home. He sees the well-watered plains that seem to him like the garden of God. But what else did it look like that the first readers of Genesis would have been intimately familiar with? It looked like the garden of God to him, but it also looked like where? Egypt. It looked like Eden, and it looked like Egypt. Was Egypt heaven? No, it's pretty close to hell on earth for them. The Jordan Plains have one aspect of paradise, but it's located right in the middle of a desert. Lot's got his eyes on a mirage, and he's going to find himself in a place that looks like the blessing of God from a distance, but is missing the presence of God up close. And look, that's what made paradise paradise. And pay attention, church people, because we can do this too, can't we? When we think about heaven, when we set our eyes on paradise, what do we tend to think about? We think about streets of gold, right? Mansions, no sickness, no tears, the well-watered gardens of paradise. And when that's all we long for, when that's all we fly towards, when that's all we hope in, you know, the enemy, the only thing he has to do is say, hey, you didn't need God for any of that. Here's a pathway to a big house. You just got to grab it. That health thing and no sickness, all you need is a yoga class and a kale diet. Here's an investment strategy, streets of gold. Here's a whole community of people who look like you and vote like you and think like you and have no disagreements with you. You don't need to wait for what you're waiting for, and you don't need the presence of God to find the purpose and the pleasure and the paradise you seek. But notice, that's the jet stream that Lot got caught up in. Those promises may promise a dimension of heaven, but they will not take you home. And I'm just betting if we lined up volunteers today, a whole bunch of you could tell that story. You know, I thought the house would make me whole. I thought the degree would make me whole. I thought the job. I thought the opportunity. I thought the relationship. I thought the sex. I thought the high. I thought the pleasure would be paradise. But you discovered the same thing Lot discovered. Setting your sights on something is really different from setting your sights on someone. The garden of the Lord is not the garden without the Lord. And as the story goes, Abraham's going to have to rescue Lot from Sodom twice. And it's going to cost Lot everything. All the things that he set his eyes on are going to go up in smoke. His financial resources, his comfort, his family, all of it. Abraham's still growing today. What's the secret for Abraham? Well, by now you're starting to spot it in the story. You notice how the chapter begins and ends? It begins and ends at an altar. At the very beginning of the chapter, as he moves into the land, Abraham's question is not, what looks best for me right now? His question at the beginning of the chapter is, God, where do you want me to go? He starts at the altar. Then at the end of the chapter, he's there again, living in a temporary tent, building a permanent altar. Last week, it was the broken pieces within him. This week, it's broken pieces around him. Abraham says, wherever I am, wherever the wind blows, whatever the crowd sounds like, whatever the scene looks like from the place I'm standing, I'm going to tune my ears to the low infrasound frequency of heaven, and I'm going to listen to the voice of the promiser to lead me and go with me and stay with me wherever I am. And from there, I will never miss home. So that's the question that we're left with this morning. How's your homing device doing these days? Are there signs you're flying off course? Do you have the wrong enemies? Are you living life generously in the abundance of his presence and his provision and the promise of the one who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills? Are your eyes set on him rather than just the mirages of his blessings? In the Lord's presence, the psalmist said, is fullness of joy and pleasures forevermore. Even in a land that looks like the wilderness, where the wind blows and the frequency of heaven is hard to hear. And if today you realize there's a problem with your internal homing mechanism, I've got good news. It's not just a you problem, not just a Lot problem. Abraham's going to continue to struggle with this too, as well as every single person around you this morning. This is why Jesus came. Not to condemn you for flying to Alabama, to rescue you and carry you home. Like, this is the way Jesus lived, yeah? Like, all of his life, he constantly picked fights, the right fights with the right people, the right time, in the right way. He lived open-handedly and generously to the point of giving his life for the joy set before him, not the material trappings of heaven, the blessings and joy and pleasure that's found only and always in the presence of the Father, who invites you and me to tune our eyes and our ears to his promises, and who promises to lead us home first class. Would you bow your head with me? If today you realize that there's something off with your homing device, and perhaps you've never flown towards Jesus at all, you're a long way away from the heart of the Father, there's good news for you. This is why Jesus came. He came to the earth, lived a perfect life, died a sinner's death, so that he could pay for your sins, to forgive every single one of them, and so that he could rescue you and carry you all the way home. And you can have rescue this morning as a gift. It costs you nothing. It's as simple as right where you're at, telling him in the privacy of your heart, Lord, I need to be rescued. I'm never going to find home by myself. I'm too far away. But I believe you can take me there. And I'm trusting you with my life. Lord, for those who are trusting you for the very first time today, some of us, Lord, who know that at some point in our life, our heart resonated with the frequency of home, and you're going to be faithful to your promise to carry us there, and yet we've flown a long way off track. We're 4,000 miles off course from here today. Lord, would you take us back home? Some of us who find ourselves realizing that we're fighting the wrong enemies, even when we're right. We've been wrong, the wrong way. Lord, would you allow us to reorient our worldview in a way that flies back towards you? Lord, some of us, we find ourselves living lives that it's all about grabbing for us, so that we never have to trust anyone with our life, including you. Would you let us, Lord, loosen our grip, not just to hold more of your blessings, but to live generously in the world where we live. And will you let us be people, Lord, whose eyes and hearts are tuned towards your voice, even when it's awfully hard for others to hear. Even when it's awfully hard for us to hear, would you let us be people who tune our hearts towards you and fly toward you? Would you let us live even in this world like we're home? Because through Jesus, we live in the presence of the one who brings fullness of joy. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Hey, thanks for watching. If something you heard resonated with you today, we would love to connect with you. Visit doxology.church/connect or leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed today's message and you want to see more, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos.